There is a growing mismatch between the large matric numbers produced every year and the ability of the higher education sector to adequately and sufficiently absorb these students. A total of 87% of learners who sat for their matric exams passed, and almost half of these achieved a bachelor's pass. However, a huge number of them will not have access to universities. Some institutions have received applications that were 30 times higher than they could accommodate. Alungile Kamtshe is president of the South African Student Congress, and he joins me live. Alungile, good to speak to you as always. Now, how bad is the student accommodation crisis right now? There's just been so much information coming through around the challenges that students are facing.
It is quite bad, Hugo. It is very bad because most of the students, as we're speaking right now, they are in city halls. Some are with their relatives in whatever city they've gotten their admission in that particular institution. So it is very bad.
Now, what are the main issues with the NSFAS private accommodation platform? Because it seems to be a key area as well.
Well, there are failures as they are being exposed. It begins with the broken down relationship between NSFAS and private accommodation providers. As you know, that majority of the student accommodation in South Africa is privately owned. So that broken down relationship is what is causing the crisis that we're experiencing right now. Of course, that problem emanates from the lack of honest conversation between these two parties. So it is causing a havoc for students and might literally tamper with the academic project of this year.
Now, what role should universities play in providing student housing?
That is an interesting question, Hugo, because, as a South African Students' Congress, we've started a campaign for institutions of higher learning to disclose their reserves, huge amounts of money in those reserves, as we suspect that that money should be redirected to building, conducive student accommodation so that, we expand the availability of this student accommodation and residential placement for students. So institutions at the moment, they are not playing much role, to be honest. They are just bystanders in a tic-tac war between NSFAS and the accommodation providers. So we want institutions to play a meaningful role by utilizing those reserves, because what good use of that money if it is just kept and not being, deployed into ensuring that there's building of the student accommodation.
Now let's talk about the students themselves and preparedness for accommodation. Now, in one of the conversations that one of my colleagues had on the channel, there was the assumption by students that because they've been accepted into university, that immediately the university would offer them accommodation, and almost a breakdown in communication or a failure to understand those processes. Could this be a contributing factor to the number of students that are now sleeping in hallways and are ill-prepared for being accommodated when they do go to university?
Look, it's just not easy to blame students at this point. Remember that student accommodation in the past, the placement, that is the allocation of a student once they are admitted into an institution, that task used to be undertaken by the university. But right now, as we're saying that the universities, they are just bystanders. It's like the problem with the private accommodation arrangement as it is conducted by the NSFAS in its accreditation is that even if a student were to access that residence, once anything happens to them, even if it's harm, crime, whatsoever, the university is able to stand far and say, no, we're not liable for that because that is not our accommodation. So that lack of reconciliation of systems between the universities, private accommodation providers, and NSFAS is what is causing a problem for us.
So let's rewind a little bit and talk towards the campaign that you're talking about, where you're urging universities to do more in as far as accommodation for students is concerned. Are you getting any traction?
Not yet, but it's growing. Not yet, but it's growing. I mean, at the moment, we are indicting with certain institutions that there's a need, and the others are panicking because it may very well seem that institutions are not interested in using those reserves. Those reserves are quite important because those are monies that belongs to the public. It's a public institution after all. So we are going to pick up this campaign, and it's going to get enough traction for that to happen. And If institutions are refusing to disclose, of course, we'll use Popeye Act. We'll have to approach an illegal persona who's willing to assist us, who's willing to be with us, so that we have those reserves being disclosed so that they can be utilized profitably for students.
Now, I'd imagine that one of the parties or your alliances could be the Department of Higher Education. Who else are you speaking to in order to garner the necessary support?
Everyone in society. We're interacting with you, Hugo, so that everyone in society understands this necessary campaign. Of course, the department has to play a meaningful role. It has to play a meaningful role. That's why we are also on a huge campaign to seek for the amendment of the Higher Education Act so that the ministry can have enough powers to actually determine the direction of these institutions of higher learning, because the autonomy that is presented before us is what causes a hindrance for the minister anyway to do anything effectively in these institutions. So these are going together. The amendments of the Higher Education Act, imagine the Higher Education Act was last amended in 2016. So it's been long overdue. So there are sections where we wish that there are amendments so that there can be effectiveness of governance in these institutions. The minister then must be a party into calling for these institutions to disclose their reserves so that these reserves are used to building student accommodation.
So walk us through some of those amendments that you would be pushing for or that you do think are long overdue.
We'll be presenting the first draft, Hugo, before the end of March, because right now we've had our own interactive session, a strategy session known as the National Executive Committee, where we were able to tick there and there in the context of governance, the funding of higher education, also the representation in the context of students, that is the Student Representative Council. What role does it play? Is it enough? And all of that. So we'll be presenting the first draft to the public before the end of March.
Okay, Alungile, finally, now let's talk about how the students are currently coping and what support is available. And I suppose in that same conversation, we must talk about the safety of these students, particularly when they're having to live or be accommodated in halls, for instance, or hallways, and obviously the level of risk that is associated with a lack of accommodation.
There's high risk. And you know what burdens students the most is that they're expected to perform, they're expected to pass, they're expected to graduate to the next level in terms of their academic program. There's no taking into consideration whatsoever about these kinds of challenges. I mean, they're traumatized. Some, they go through exposure of serious harm, gender-based violence. So it is quite problematic for students. And once at the end of the year, you will see the skyscraping numbers of appeals. And the blame will be cast on students, whereas the problem has been these three parties that can't get under one roof and form a solution that will be long-lasting. So it is quite traumatic for students, I can tell you, Hugo.
Alungile Kamtshe, SASCO president, speaking to us this afternoon and walking us through those challenges with accommodation for university students. Thanks for your time.